Your silence after his rejection is tearing his world apart. What if the loudest message you ever sent was your silence? Could walking away without a word be the most powerful statement of all? This is not just about absence, it's about reclaiming every piece of yourself he never saw. Have you ever been so hurt by someone's rejection that you found yourself grasping for words? Any words to explain, to defend, to hold on? And yet nothing came, just silence. A silence not born of defeat, but of something deeper, something unshakable. There's a strange kind of power in that stillness, a quiet that speaks louder than 1,000 explanations. We live in a world that begs us to respond, to justify ourselves, to speak our pain. But sometimes the most stoic thing you can do is say, absolutely nothing. Not out of bitterness, not to provoke guilt, but because in the silence, you reclaim your power. You remember who you are, and the one who dismissed you. That silence doesn't just echo, it rattles their very world. This episode isn't about silence as revenge, it's about silence as strength, as a return to your center, a mirror held up to those who took you for granted, and a path back to your own peace. Because the absence of your voice might just be the loudest thing they hear. Let's begin. 1. Your silence doesn't punish, it reveals. There's a moment after rejection when every fiber of you wants to speak, to ask why, to plead for clarity, to fill the space with something, anything, that will soften the sting. But then you don't. You stay quiet. And in that quiet, something extraordinary happens. Not to them, but to you. The silence becomes a mirror, and the reflection is not of weakness, but of truth. Silence doesn't punish. That's the mistake people often make. They think your silence is a tactic, a cold shoulder, a way to strike back. But silence isn't about them. It's about you. It doesn't carry the energy of revenge, but the energy of revelation. Because when you stop explaining yourself, when you resist the urge to beg for closure or recognition, what you're actually doing is letting the truth rise. And that truth often speaks volumes. It reveals who really had the power all along. It shows who was willing to speak with honesty and who only spoke to control. It lays bare who cared and who only pretended to. Because when words fall away, what remains is behavior, intent, presence, or absence. The Stoics understood this deeply. They didn't see silence as withdrawal or surrender. They saw it as clarity. Epictetus once taught that we should listen more than we speak, because nature gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth. But it goes beyond that. In choosing not to respond, you are not punishing the other person. You are simply refusing to participate in the illusion anymore. You are saying without words, I will not invest energy in what no longer honors me. And for the one who rejected you, the silence isn't loud. It's deafening, because it doesn't give them what they expect. No protest, no anger, no emotional validation. Just the stillness of someone who no longer needs to fight for what should have been freely given. Think about this. Sometimes the greatest shift in a relationship comes not when someone says something powerful, but when someone chooses to say nothing at all. That silence forces reflection. It creates space, and in that space, the other person is left to sit with their own choices. You're not disappearing, you're stepping back. Not to punish but to protect, to observe, to reflect, and most of all to let the truth speak for itself. Because in your silence, everything they failed to see suddenly becomes clear. 2. He who didn't value your presence will feel the weight of your absence. There's a kind of confidence that doesn't shout. It doesn't beg, doesn't chase, doesn't plead to be seen. It simply walks away quietly, firmly, and lets the echo of that absence do the talking. Because here's a truth most people learn the hard way. Those who didn't appreciate your presence will eventually be haunted by the silence you leave behind. When someone takes you for granted, they expect you to always be there. They get used to your kindness, your patience, your steady loyalty, as if these were obligations, not choices. And so when you go silent, when your voice no longer fills the space they once took for granted, it confuses them. At first they might convince themselves it's nothing, but day by day the absence grows louder. Not because you're making a scene, but because you're no longer part of theirs. The Stoics would tell us, don't concern yourself with what people think of your silence. What matters is that you remained true to your nature, and sometimes your nature calls for distance, for quiet, for the retreat that brings peace. Marcus Aurelius in his Meditations reminded himself that if someone doesn't see the value of a thing, that doesn't make the thing any less valuable. The same goes for people. Just because someone didn't honor your worth doesn't mean you weren't worthy. It simply means they weren't capable of recognizing what they had. What happens next is not up to you. You've withdrawn not as an act of drama, but as an act of dignity, and in time they may feel it. Not just the emptiness of your physical presence, but the lack of emotional safety you once offered, the absence of your quiet understanding, the missing warmth of your compassion, the stability they thought would always be there. Regret has a way of arriving silently. It doesn't show up all at once. It trickles in through quiet nights, through familiar places, through reminders they didn't expect. And that's when they begin to feel it. The weight of what they dismissed, the gravity of what they lost. You don't have to remind them. You don't have to send messages, explain your silence, or hope they notice. Life has a way of making the right echoes find their way back, and in your absence, the lessons they failed to learn in your presence might finally begin to take root. You were not invisible, they were just blind. And now that you're gone, the blindness lifts and they're left facing the space you used to fill. 3. Resisting the urge to speak is an act of power. There is a moment right after the sting of rejection when your mind floods with words you wish you could say. You rehearse responses, defenses, maybe even clever comebacks meant to prove a point. You think of everything they missed, everything they misunderstood, and you burn with the urge to make them see it, to hear you, to feel just a fraction of what you felt. But you don't speak. You don't send the message. You don't chase. And that restraint, that is power. In a world that constantly encourages us to respond, to speak up, to react quickly, silence can feel unnatural, even weak. But it's not. Not when it's intentional. Not when it's rooted in self-respect. Because silence, especially when your emotions are screaming for release, is one of the greatest forms of self-control you can ever develop. Think about it. Anyone can react. Anyone can type a long message in the heat of anger. Anyone can explain, plead, defend. But to stay still, to breathe deeply through the wave of reaction, and choose deliberately not to act on it, that requires a strength most never train. And that's where the Stoic mindset offers a path few dare to follow. Epictetus once said, "It's not what happens to you but how you react to it that matters." This isn't just a clever quote, it's a challenge to pause, to step outside the noise of your immediate emotions, because while they are real, and while you are absolutely entitled to feel them, you are not obligated to act on them. The Stoics weren't about denying emotion. They were about mastery over it. Not suppression, but sovereignty. And here's the thing about speaking in those moments of emotional intensity. We often don't say what we mean. We say what we feel. The words come out not as truth but as reaction. And once they're out there, they can't be taken back. They can cloud your dignity. They can dilute the clarity of your silence. They can give the other person power they no longer deserve. When you resist the urge to speak, You're doing something radical. You're removing yourself from the emotional battlefield. You're refusing to validate the situation with further energy. You're standing in a space where you decide when and if you'll respond. And that control, that's what power really looks like. Sometimes people expect you to break your silence. They wait for the emotional fallout, for the texts, for the anger. They expect it because it reaffirms their importance. But when none of that comes, when all they hear is your absence, they're left to face their own reflection. No distraction, no defense, just your quiet withdrawal. And in that space they start to wonder, did I misjudge them? Did I push too far? Why aren't they reacting the way I thought they would? That's when the silence becomes its own kind of language. It's not cold. It's not cruel. It's clear. It says, I am no longer giving you access to my energy. It says, I respect myself too much to beg for your understanding. It says, I could speak, but I won't. Not because I'm afraid, but because I've already said everything that matters just by walking away. There's a kind of peace that follows this choice. At first it might feel like holding back, like unfinished business. But with time, it turns into liberation. You begin to realize that you don't need the last word. You don't need to be understood by someone who chose not to listen the first time. You don't need to explain your worth to someone who questioned it. And that realization shifts the energy completely. In fact, the longer you remain silent, the more you begin to hear yourself again without the noise of conflict, the tension of waiting for their reply or the pressure to defend your perspective. You return to yourself. You begin to process the pain more cleanly. You grieve without distortion. And eventually you heal more completely. So no, resisting the urge to speak is not weakness. It's wisdom. It's emotional discipline. It's the quiet understanding that your peace is worth more than any explanation. And it's a declaration, one without words, that you are in charge of your narrative, not the one who rejected you. In silence, you become unshakable. You no longer need their validation, nor do you depend on their recognition to feel whole. You know your truth. You faced the storm of emotion and stayed still. And when you rise from that stillness, it won't be to chase or to argue. It will be to continue forward lighter, freer, and stronger than you were before. 4. Silence returns you to yourself. There is a moment after the disappointment, the confusion, the silence of the other person, when you finally begin to hear something else. Not their voice, not their absence, but your own. And that is where the healing begins. Because silence, real silence, isn't an empty space. It's a return, a reconnection, a reunion with the person who has been quietly waiting inside you all along. We spend so much of our energy projecting outward, trying to be understood, trying to fix what broke, trying to prove that we were worthy of being chosen, of being fought for, of being kept. And in all that noise, we forget ourselves. We forget what it feels like to sit in our own presence without chasing answers from someone who's already turned away. But when we stop speaking, when we allow silence to stretch beyond discomfort, it slowly starts to become something sacred. The Stoics knew the value of this space. Marcus Aurelius often wrote to himself, not to the world, because he understood that the most important conversations we'll ever have are the ones we have within. He wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." But how can you even see those thoughts clearly when you're constantly reacting, constantly reaching outward? Silence becomes the canvas where your true colors return, the space where your soul regains its shape. And no, it doesn't happen instantly. At first, silence feels like emptiness, like abandonment, like punishment. But if you stay there long enough, if you resist the urge to fill it with distractions or hollow conversations, you begin to notice a shift. Your breathing slows, your mind softens, your pain, once screaming, begins to whisper. And beneath that whisper, you find you. Because the truth is, you were never lost. You were just buried under their rejection, under your own expectations, under the story you told yourself about what should have happened. Silence is how you start to peel all of that away. It doesn't ask for performance, it doesn't judge. It simply waits for you to arrive and finally listen. This is where power returns. Not the kind of power that needs to control or prove something to others, but the quiet strength of someone who is no longer at war with themselves. Someone who no longer needs to be chosen by another to feel whole. That kind of self-possession cannot be faked. It's built moment by moment in the stillness you once feared. Silence allows reflection, and reflection breeds clarity. You begin to see the patterns you once denied. You recognize what you tolerated, what you accepted, and why. Not to blame yourself, but to understand. Because in that understanding, you find the seed of transformation. You realize that closure isn't something they give you. It's something you give yourself the moment you stop needing them to validate your pain. And what happens next is beautiful. You start doing things not to be seen, but because they bring you peace. You choose solitude not as an escape, but as a sacred return. You walk, you write, you sit in stillness, not to fill time, but to meet yourself again. You stop waiting for a message that may never come, because your own inner voice has become louder, clearer, wiser. You also begin to remember your own value, not in contrast to the person who rejected you, but in absolute terms. In silence, you remember what it feels like to belong to yourself, to be your own sanctuary, to feel safe in your own presence. That's not loneliness. That's freedom. And maybe the most powerful part. The world begins to notice. They sense the shift, not in what you say, but in what you no longer need to say. Your silence speaks of someone who isn't waiting anymore, who isn't hoping for closure, who has moved inward, not out of retreat, but out of strength. They might wonder why you don't reach out anymore, why you stopped chasing. They might interpret your quiet as pride or indifference, but they'll never truly understand that what happened wasn't an act of detachment. It was an act of rebirth. You didn't vanish. You simply found your way back to the one person who was never supposed to leave, you. So when silence feels heavy, when it aches in the chest and echoes in the mind, remember this. It's not empty. It's sacred. It's your return. And the more you allow yourself to sit in it, to breathe through it, the more you will uncover what was always there. Your own resilience, your own wisdom, your own peace. In silence, you stop performing and start being. And that is where real healing, real power, and real clarity begin. 5. The mind quits before the body. Endurance begins in stillness. There's a breaking point we all meet when we're pushed physically, emotionally, mentally. That moment when something in you says, I can't do this anymore. And for most, that moment becomes the finish line. But what if it wasn't? What if that voice inside you isn't truth, but habit? What if it's not the body that gives up, but the mind that surrenders first? The Stoics were obsessed with the idea of endurance, not just in the sense of physical survival, but in mastering the space between stimulus and response. They believed that the true battlefield wasn't outside of us. It was within. That the fiercest opponent we'll ever face is our own comfort, our own resistance, our own urge to stop when things get hard. Think about it. The body can endure more than we often allow it to. The lungs can breathe through discomfort. The legs can keep moving even when they ache. The heart can bear sorrow deeper than we imagine. But the mind wants relief. It craves comfort. It searches for a reason to let go, to back down, to retreat. And if we don't train it intentionally, consistently, it becomes our master instead of our servant. This is where the Stoic practice of hardship comes in, not as punishment, but as preparation. Epictetus, born into slavery and living through years of hardship, believed that true freedom came not from avoiding pain, but from rising above it. He once said, "Difficulties show men what they are." In other words, challenge doesn't break you, it reveals you. And silence. Silence is often the beginning of that endurance, because endurance doesn't just mean pushing through a hard workout or surviving heartbreak. Sometimes endurance looks like sitting still when your whole being wants to reach out. It looks like not responding when every nerve is screaming to defend yourself. It looks like carrying pain with grace without making it someone else's burden. That's mental endurance, and it's forged in silence. Athletes train their bodies, but warriors train their minds. And the Stoics were warriors of the inner world. They practiced voluntary discomfort, cold baths, sparse meals, sleeping on the floor, not to suffer for the sake of suffering, but to remind themselves that comfort is not a necessity for strength, that we can choose to endure. And in that choice, we reclaim power. The same applies emotionally. That silence after rejection, that stillness after being dismissed, it's not a void, it's training. Every moment you resist the urge to speak, to act out, to beg for validation, you're building a muscle, one that doesn't show on the outside, but changes everything on the inside. And here's where it shifts. Eventually, what once felt unbearable starts to feel manageable. You begin to realize that the threshold you thought was your limit was just your fear. That voice that said this is too much wasn't your truth. It was your discomfort speaking. And by sitting in that discomfort, by breathing through it instead of running from it, you stretch. You grow. You expand into someone more resilient than you were before. You don't need to scream to prove you're strong. You don't need to win an argument to prove your worth. Sometimes the most powerful endurance is the one that goes unnoticed, the one that takes place in the silent decision to keep walking even when the path is steep, to stay still even when the pain claws at your chest, to hold your ground, not out of pride, but out of peace. And yes, people might misunderstand your silence. They may mistake it for weakness, for coldness, for indifference. But what they'll never see is the battle you've already won just by staying composed, just by not reacting, just by letting the storm pass through you without letting it destroy you. Endurance isn't about proving anything to anyone. It's about discovering what lives in you when everything else is stripped away, when no one's watching, when there's no applause, just you and your will to remain standing. The mind will always try to quit before the body does, before your soul does. Train it to wait. Train it to endure. Train it to serve something greater than comfort, your character. Because on the other side of that silence, that stillness, that pause isn't weakness. It's unshakable strength, and it's yours. 6. Regret is not your burden. There's a silent weight that creeps in after rejection. Not just the pain of loss, but the questions that echo in its wake. What if I had said more? What if I had stayed quiet? Was it my fault? These aren't just passing thoughts. They can become anchors, dragging your mind into loops of guilt, self-blame, and imagined scenarios that never happened. But here's what the Stoics would remind you. Regret, when it doesn't lead to growth, is nothing but a chain, and it's not yours to carry. You see, regret often disguises itself as responsibility. You start to feel like if only you had been more available, less emotional, more perfect, more something, then maybe things would have turned out differently. But that illusion is dangerous. It places the entire outcome of a relationship or a rejection on your shoulders, forgetting that relationships are never built or broken by one person alone. The Stoics teach us to separate what is within our control from what isn't. Your words, your actions, your integrity, those are yours. But their choices, their perception, their ability to recognize your worth, that's theirs. You could have said the perfect thing. You could have given more, loved harder, been your best self, and they still could have chosen to walk away. That's not your failure. That's their decision. And regret over someone else's choice is wasted pain. This doesn't mean you never reflect. Reflection is growth. You can ask, did I act in alignment with my values? If yes, then you've already done your part. If no, then you learn. Not to carry the shame forever, but to move forward more consciously. Regret that turns into learning is useful. Regret that turns into self-punishment is poison. And here's another truth. Often the people who reject you are carrying their own regrets. They may not show it. They may mask it with pride, silence, or indifference, but that doesn't mean it's not there. The irony is that the one who chose to walk away may one day feel the exact regret you're carrying now. But by the time they realize what they lost, you'll have already released the weight they tried to leave in your hands. Because regret, when it doesn't belong to you, becomes a trap, a slow erosion of self-worth. And what you owe yourself now is not a mental courtroom replaying every detail, but a soft, firm decision. I did the best I could with the knowledge I had at the time. I showed up as myself, and I will not carry the guilt for someone else's inability to see that. Even if you made mistakes, they don't define you. They're moments, not your entire identity. And often the silence that follows rejection becomes a mirror, not just for them, but for you. It shows you where your peace begins and where your need for external validation ends. It reminds you that your worth isn't contingent on someone staying. It was always there even before they arrived. Letting go of regret isn't the same as forgetting. It's choosing not to let it rot the present. It's understanding that carrying a wound doesn't mean you have to keep pressing on it. You can let it scab, you can let it scar, and you can move on. Sometimes people want you to regret. That's their silent victory. That you'll crumble without them, that you'll live in the shadow of what if. But the real triumph, the Stoic triumph, is this. You live with open eyes and a quiet heart, knowing that nothing done with integrity is ever truly a loss. So if you're holding on to regret today, ask yourself, is this helping me grow, or is it keeping me stuck? Because pain may be part of the process, but suffering, endless unnecessary suffering, that's optional. And you have the power right now to choose differently. Release what isn't yours. Keep what makes you stronger. And remember, regret belongs to those who chose to let go of something valuable, not to those who had the courage to offer it in the first place. 7. Silence as a filter of truth. When all the noise fades, when there are no more messages, no more excuses, no more half-hearted apologies, you're left with silence. At first it feels cold, unsettling, like the end of something. But if you sit with it long enough, you realize something powerful. Silence doesn't just reflect absence, it reveals truth. Most people fear silence because it removes the distraction. It strips away the performances, the justifications, the illusions. It forces you to confront what's real, not what you hoped for, not what you imagined, but what actually exists when nothing is being said. And that's when you start to see things as they are, not as you wanted them to be. In the Stoic tradition, truth isn't something you chase externally, it's something you strip down to. Epictetus said, "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak." But silence, real silence, isn't just about listening to others. It's about listening to what reality is telling you without interference, without interpretation, without emotional distortion. Because sometimes the most honest answer is no answer at all. When someone disappears without explanation, that's an answer. When they stop checking in, stop showing up, stop caring, that's an answer. When you're always the one reaching out and they never do, that's an answer too. Silence filters through all the stories we tell ourselves, the justifications we invent, the fantasies we cling to. It doesn't lie. It doesn't sugarcoat. It just reflects. And sometimes that hurts more than words ever could. But pain, when it's grounded in truth, becomes clarity. And clarity is freedom. We often say we want closure, but what we're really asking for is a version of the story that makes rejection feel less painful, something that softens the blow. But silence doesn't do that. It gives you nothing. And in that nothing, you find everything you need to know. Think about it. If someone can go days, weeks, even months without wondering how you are, what does that tell you? If your absence doesn't move them, disturb them, shake them, why would their presence be worth chasing? Silence doesn't just show you who they are. It shows you what you truly meant to them and what they chose to do with that meaning. And it shows you something else too. Your strength. The strength to not fill the silence with begging. To not demand closure from someone who already chose distance. To not lower your voice just to be heard by someone who stopped listening. That's dignity. That's power. That's your truth showing through. This is the paradox. Silence, though often mistaken for weakness, is a form of discipline. It says, I don't need to explain myself anymore. I've already said enough. And now I'm going to watch what's real reveal itself, because what survives in silence is real. What disappears in silence was never yours to hold. Eventually, the silence becomes a mirror. Not just reflecting them, but reflecting you. You start to see the patterns you ignored, the red flags you excused, the energy you gave away too freely. You see how long you clung to words over actions. How much time you spent trying to prove your worth to someone who wouldn't recognize it, even if it screamed in their face. But here's the beauty of the filter. It doesn't just show you what's wrong. It makes space for what's right. The moment you stop chasing noise, you begin to hear yourself again. And in that quiet, you realize you don't need them to come back. You just needed the truth to stand still, long enough for you to see it. So don't run from the silence. Let it work. Let it clean out the illusions. Let it remove everything and everyone that was never aligned with you to begin with. It might feel empty now, but soon that space will become sacred. And in that space you'll build something better. A life grounded in truth, not fantasy. A voice that doesn't need to shout to be heard. And a heart that no longer depends on someone else's noise to feel worthy. 8. The mask of indifference is not real. He acts like it didn't matter, like your silence was just a momentary pause. In his day, easily replaced, quickly forgotten. Maybe he posts a story, makes a joke, walks through the world like nothing ever touched him. But here's what you need to remember. Indifference is a mask, and masks always slip. The Stoics didn't fear appearances. They questioned them. They understood that what people show on the surface is often the opposite of what's buried underneath. Epictetus said, "It's not what happens to you but how you react to it that matters." But reactions aren't always loud. Sometimes they're quiet, disguised, restrained. And in that quietness, in that performance of not caring, there's often turmoil, trying to stay hidden. Think about it. People don't go out of their way to act unbothered unless they're bothered. They don't need to prove they've moved on unless a part of them is still stuck. So when he pretends your silence didn't shake him, when he overcompensates with coldness, distraction, or false confidence, it's not strength. It's discomfort wearing pride like a shield. Here's the truth. If he truly felt nothing, he wouldn't need to perform it. He wouldn't need to avoid eye contact. He wouldn't need to post carefully curated stories that scream, "Look how good I'm doing without you." He wouldn't need to joke about it, ignore it, or pretend like you vanished without leaving a mark. Indifference that's real is quiet and effortless. It doesn't need to be announced. But when someone is wounded by your absence and doesn't know how to handle it, indifference becomes a mask they wear to keep their ego intact. And maybe you've doubted yourself. Maybe you've looked at his silence, or worse, his casual attitude, and thought, Maybe I really didn't matter. Maybe he never cared. But that's the trap. That's where your mind becomes its own worst enemy, because his inability to express hurt isn't evidence of your insignificance. It's a reflection of his emotional limitations. Some people were never taught how to grieve the loss of connection. Some were taught that vulnerability equals weakness, so instead of sitting with discomfort, they avoid it. They bury it. They put on a face. But silence, your silence has a way of cracking that surface. Because no matter how thick the mask is, time reveals what effort tries to hide. That smirk, it wavers in private. That shrug, it weighs heavier in the dark. That I'm fine, it echoes in the spaces where your voice used to live. You don't need to see the regret to know it exists. You don't need an apology to validate your worth. You don't need a confession to know the silence made an impact. His mask may fool others. It might even fool himself for a while. But you've already moved into truth, into stillness, into a kind of quiet power that doesn't need to be proven. The greatest form of strength is not showing the world you've healed. It's actually healing. It's not pretending to be over it. It's learning from it, growing through it, and no longer needing to explain your value to someone who only understood it in your absence. So if he acts like nothing happened, let him. You don't need to play the same game. You're not in competition with his pride. You're building something deeper, something he may not even recognize until it's too late. Peace. And peace doesn't wear a mask. It doesn't fake indifference. It simply is. Let him wear whatever armor he needs to survive the silence. That's his path. But you walk unarmored, whole, awake, and free. 9. Silence is not punishment. When you choose silence, some will call it cruel. Others will see it as revenge. They'll say you're being passive-aggressive, playing games, withholding affection as a form of control. But they're wrong. Silence isn't about punishment. It's about preservation. There's a difference between punishing someone and protecting yourself. The first comes from a place of ego, the second from a place of clarity. You didn't choose silence to hurt him. You chose it because explaining yourself over and over to someone who refuses to understand becomes its own form of suffering. You chose silence because repeating your worth to someone who never listened began to feel like self-betrayal. You chose it because peace became louder than your need to be heard. In Stoic thought, silence isn't avoidance. It's discernment. It's the decision to remove your energy from a space where it's misused. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." That means not meeting ignorance with anger, not matching coldness with cruelty, but rising above, choosing stillness instead of chaos, presence instead of performance. Silence can look like absence to the outside world, but internally it's a return to center. It's a conscious refusal to participate in conversations that lead nowhere. It's the quiet removal of your attention from someone who once confused your availability with weakness. It's not punishment, it's freedom. The moment you stop trying to convince someone to care, you reclaim your power. Not by yelling, not by proving, but by stepping back. That's not cold. That's strength. Because nothing is more draining than giving your voice to someone who doesn't respect your silence. And let's be honest, if silence feels like punishment to him, maybe it's because your presence was a gift he took for granted. Maybe it's because your words always came with warmth, understanding, depth, and now the absence of that presence stings. Not because you're being cruel, but because he's finally feeling the contrast between what was and what is. You didn't create that pain. You simply stopped softening the consequences of his choices. He's not used to the echo. He's not used to the mirror that silence becomes, the way it reflects his indifference back at him. Words can be manipulated, misunderstood, twisted, but silence, Silence is undeniable. It forces him to sit with what he can't control, your boundaries. People often mistake kindness for a lack of boundaries. They assume that if you're forgiving, you'll never walk away. If you're open-hearted, you'll always explain. If you love, you'll stay. But silence breaks that illusion. It says, I cared deeply, but I care about myself too. And that moment when you stop responding isn't an act of war. It's the end of a war you've been fighting alone. The one where you tried to get through, tried to be understood, tried to keep something alive that was slowly burning you out. The war ends not with a bang, but with a breath, a pause, a silence. That's not punishment. That's peace. If someone sees your silence as an attack, ask yourself, what were they doing that made my silence feel so loud? Because people who value you, truly value you, won't be confused by your quiet. They'll reflect. They'll reach out. They'll take accountability. But the ones who are only present for the noise, they'll fade with it. So no, you're not punishing him. You're protecting your energy. You're choosing not to explain the same lesson again to someone who never stayed long enough to learn it. And maybe one day he'll understand that your silence wasn't a wall. It was a door that quietly closed after too many chances were ignored. And maybe that understanding will come too late. But by then, you won't be waiting on the other side. 10. Silence is your rebirth. There comes a moment when the silence that once felt like loss begins to feel like liberation. At first it was heavy. It echoed with all the words you didn't get to say, all the closure you never received, all the conversations that lived only in your head. But over time, something shifted. What once felt like emptiness became space. What once stung with absence became sacred. And in that quiet you began to come back to life. Because silence isn't the end of your story, it's the beginning of your rebirth. We are taught to associate movement with healing, to believe that if we're talking, explaining, fixing, then we're growing. But Stoicism teaches something different. It teaches that clarity doesn't come from reaction. It comes from reflection. It comes when we stop chasing, stop justifying, stop needing answers from people who were never ready to give them. And in that pause where the noise ends and the silence begins, you meet yourself again. Not the version of you who tried too hard to be understood. Not the version who tolerated crumbs just to feel close to someone. Not the version who confused attention for affection. But the version who remembers her own worth without needing it, reflected back through someone else's eyes. That's what silence does. It burns away the false layers, the performative smiles, the people-pleasing, the emotional bargaining. It strips everything down to your core, and it's there in that raw place that you rediscover who you are. When you're not constantly bending to be loved, you realize that you were never too much. You were just surrounded by people who were too little for the depth you carried. You realize that your boundaries were never a wall. They were a door to peace, and some people simply refuse to walk through. You realize that love isn't something you should have to prove. It's something that should feel safe, seen, and steady. And most importantly, you realize that you don't need to go back. Not to the version of yourself that settled. Not to the person who needed validation to feel whole. You've outgrown that space. You've outgrown the silence that was once weaponized against you and turned it into a sanctuary. In Stoic philosophy, the rebirth comes not from what happens to you, but from how you choose to respond. Marcus Aurelius said, "Look well into thyself. There is a source of strength which will always spring up if thou wilt always look." That strength, your strength, was never missing. It was just drowned in the noise of trying to be enough for someone who could never meet you there. Now you're no longer trying. You're no longer performing. You're simply being. And that quiet presence, the one that doesn't chase, doesn't explain, doesn't seek approval, that is your rebirth. That is your return to center. That is your rise. He may never understand what your silence meant. He may never realize that it wasn't an act of punishment, but of transformation. But that's okay, because this chapter isn't about whether he regrets losing you. It's about whether you're done losing yourself. And if you're still sitting in silence now, ask yourself, is this the end of something or the beginning of everything? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the beginning of your freedom, the return of your voice, the rise of your real self, stronger, quieter, wiser. And that silence, it's not empty. It's sacred. It's yours. And it's where the real story begins. So now, as the silence settles, we're left not with emptiness, but with clarity. You didn't choose silence to disappear. You chose it to remember who you are. Not as a tactic, not as revenge, but as a return to yourself, to your peace, to your truth. He may never say it, but your absence spoke volumes he wasn't ready to hear. Your stillness echoed in ways louder than any confrontation ever could. And if it shook his world, it's not because you were cruel. It's because you were once his calm, his center, and now you're gone. This isn't about proving anything anymore. It's not about making someone regret. It's about not losing yourself just to be heard by someone who never listened. And maybe that's the quiet power of Stoicism. Learning to stand firm in who you are even when no one applauds. Learning to walk away without slamming the door. Learning to protect your peace without needing permission. So if your silence still feels heavy, remember this. It's not the end of your voice. It's the beginning of your rebirth. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you'll ever say is nothing at all. In the end, silence is not an end. It's a threshold. The world may never fully grasp the depth of what you chose not to say, but you will. In your quiet resolve, you've not only endured, you've transformed. Let the silence stand. Let it speak, and let it lead you to the life you were always meant to live, whole, sovereign, and beautifully unshaken.